So the goal of the talk is to describe an engagement-focused point of view to be used as a tool to analyze the user's experience. The idea here is that, The idea here is that we want to understand the work we do and start seeing it from as elemental a point of view as possible. I think game design as a discipline has gotten really big and really complicated. And so the talk's goal is to get us to understand kind of some of the basic pieces of user activity. So I'm going to start with my story. I've been a game designer for 17 years, and I started off in console and been a very console-focused developer, at least for the first decade. And in that period of time, I spent a lot of my time focused on designs for systems and mechanics, especially controls, like in the case of Spider-Man 2. Over the course of my experience, I had opportunities to hire and train and cultivate new designers. I found that to be a really important part of my own development as a designer. And learning about creative direction and what it really means to enforce a shared understanding of the product. But in the last 7 years especially, I underwent a shift in attitude. Those of us in the game industry from a long time back had a very expert audience. And as a result, we were making games in some ways for ourselves. The change that really influenced things is the incoming audience that came as a result of Facebook and mobile. We went from tens of millions of users to hundreds of millions of users. And kind of that induced a change in the audience. And so my confidence in what a user thinks and what drives their motivation was shaken at that point. And so I needed to transition from feeling comfortable about how to make games to servicing the needs of my users and investigating them and understanding them well. I have a bullet point here that said, Facebook games made me a better person. I admit that as a developer from console that I had a lot of bias and prejudice against the new kinds of games that were being released. In particular at the time, the Facebook games like Mafia Wars and Cityville. What I did was I sat myself down and forced myself to play it until I liked it. I realized that I was too close-minded in my understanding of what users are interested in. And because of that, I was actually assigning a lack of independence to those users. I was saying that they aren't allowed to make their own choices. When in fact, if you play those games enough and you grow to like them, you find what it is about that experience that makes the user tick, makes them keep coming back, makes them enjoy what they're doing, and ultimately convert to monetizing. And so, just to kind of recap on that point, those of us in the old school had a very strong comfort zone, and breaking out of that forced us to go down a path of understanding users better. So I'm going to just briefly kind of go over some of my thoughts on what game design is. So game design is a really broad idea, like I said it before, but if you want to distill it down into its simplest pieces, all it really ends up being is a description of sorts. You're trying to describe what the product is. Now, ultimately, the way you end up describing that product, though, is going to start affecting the way you make it. So let's say I made a very clinical and exhaustive description of all the things that a user can and can't do, and describe the way the screens look, and use that specification to then start development. There aren't any, in that model of documentation, there's no description of why anything is in place. And so the development process actually can't accommodate any of those needs as it moves forward and discovers errors in the initial assumption. And so if you wanted to go up a level from that, you'd start trying to build a design based around what you want users to get out of your experience. And at the very end, and by that logic, the specific design is simply the first stab at a solution to the problem. And another important point to make is that you can't expect your product to exhibit anything that you've never described in how it should be made. So, assuming that the way you approach the design of a game is to take a number of perspectives to try to understand what users need and use that as a kind of a guideline to explain what it is the product needs to have. Every single one of the ways in which you try to describe something is going to have some inherent bias. The point of view that you end up taking in that description is going to be made less accurate by what you fail to describe and the assumptions that are built into that description. To go back to the other example where let's say I describe the game very clinically and I present that as the kind of driver for development. Because I didn't describe what the whys are, no one who's developing that game can adjust for priority in terms of what the experience should be supporting. So the most important part of an experience, although it might seem obvious in the description, hasn't been laid out or described as the most important element. And the second most important element, that priority ends up allowing you to approach development with a little more flexibility and allows you to make the necessary adjustments going forward. And naturally, since any given point of view is going to be biased when it comes to describing the basics of a game's design, using multiple points of view is an essential component of mitigating that. So on to the actual engagement part of what I'm trying to describe. So engagement as a basic element. It's the desire here is to try to get to a fundamental understanding of what's going on with users so that you can use, at least in this case, use it as a device to assess the work that you've planned out. I'm not recommending that anyone take the most elementary perspective and try to build an actual experience with that in mind. However, understanding the very basics is a great way to then go back through what you've built and try to rate various elements of the game experience. So think of it as a matter of attention and a given user's degree of focus. Less engagement is diffusion of attention, and more engagement is focusing of attention. The way that ends up working is that the more focused I am, the more inertia my engagement has or my attention has. It's harder to deflect my focus on this particular thing. As it goes down, what's happening is I'm opening myself up to start exploring other options. And one of those options is to stop doing what I'm doing and try to move on to something else. Obviously, it has to fluctuate over time. Anything that happens in a game experience, whether you're swinging through the skies in Spider-Man or, buying spaceships in Plundernauts, from one moment to the next, my engagement levels are naturally going to ebb and flow. So in this case, the recommendation starts becoming viewing your experience as a sequence of highs and lows with the express purpose of developing tactics to kind of increase highs and defend against low points. So engagement highs revolve around exploration and discovery and success. It's as simple as the button pressing example up there, where if I do something and I get any response, that engages me briefly. The trick ends up being, though, how long you can sustain highly focused states for players and understanding what that really means. Because in the case of like a first-person shooter multiplayer experience, there's an extremely high engagement situation that can be sustained for relatively long periods of time. The activity itself has a long lifespan because of it, partly because of its difficulty, partly because of the variety of interacting with other human beings. I think an interesting analogy is to compare it to Flappy Bird, which generally actually creates the same level of intense engagement and can sustain it for relatively long periods of time. They share very little on the surface, but what makes them basically the same is that they're very difficult experiences that get you to keep coming back and to keep your attention focused, and you have a difficulty getting deflected from that focus on that game experience. So the lows, they might seem obvious, although I think that there's some interesting features of trying to see it kind of generically as an engagement low. The first line here, separate success from completion. Those two things they're often coincidental, but the two things are very different. Success is something that's going to increase my interest in what's going on, and it's going to try to start, increasing my focus on something. Whereas completion, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. The moment you finish anything is a moment when you're ready to move on. And so a lot of easy mistakes can be made in a game experience where you're given feedback that you've completed something, and in too long a time frame, you come back trying to move them into the next activity. The transition from one activity to another should be as smooth as possible so as to avoid that kind of dip in their engagement level that could lead to churning out. The other side of that is confusion is basically the enemy of high engagement. In order for me to have my attention highly focused, I can't have questions about what I need to do. There can be questions about how to perform well, and there can be like a motivation to do my best and pay very close attention to what's in front of me. But the moment I don't understand what I need to do, my engagement levels are going to drop rapidly, and it's kind of the other side of the coin, where one is resolution will lead to a desire to do something else, and the other is confusion blocks me from making choices going forward. And why worry about the lows? Because all the churn out events happen during low engagement periods. So to talk about repetition in terms of engagement, I think it's a really important component of it. It's something that plagues game design constantly. You can't make an infinitely various system. They're inevitably, depending on what you make, there's certain limits to how much variety you can deliver, depending on how many resources you have available and what your time budgets are. If you start seeing that engagement naturally decays over time, or that the user's kind of using up whatever material is necessary to kind of be engaged, and that he'll eventually consume all the available variety, by that logic, the variety ends up becoming kind of like a fuel for the engine that's driving the engagement. And to see, I think sometimes we get in a place where we're talking about repetition as a bad thing, and that we try to avoid it, when that might be a little bit askew from the logic. The logic of it should be that you need to assess the activities you make available for your users in terms of how much lifespan they have, how much inherent variety is there, how much difficulty in mastering the tools that are, or the mechanics that are there to handle that activity. And once you understand that, you can start making more informed decisions about how much linear variety that the system actually needs in order to kind of support that activity before moving on to the next. Another insight I feel like this perspective gives is to rethink the idea of rewards in general. So if completion is a natural low point in the engagement curve, that moment where I go, I'm done, so now what? You need to think about, we often pay the player off for winning or accomplishing what they need to do. I think that that's the wrong attitude to take. What you want to be thinking about is, I'm giving you a reward as an incentive to continue. And so, like in this example, if some of the bushes in the Nintendo world spit out coins, it's going to drive me to look through more and more bushes, which will lead to exploration. And those rewards now are incremental and part of the continuum of that activity, rather than I killed the boss and I got a bunch of points, which is a great way to say you did a great job, time for you to move on. So as far as some more practical things that we need to be thinking about nowadays with the games that are coming out, retention is an overwhelming concern. Trying to keep users from session to session, trying to keep users for hours, days, months, years. These are the things that can end up, I would say that it's a primary thing between people's success and failure. And I would attribute that to most of our inability to actually assess the game experience for how much user engagement it can support. What ends up happening, I feel like, is there are a lot of great ideas out there, but that when users actually get their hands on them, the way in which it's designed allows for it to get used up too quickly. And so, how do you get users to come back? Assuming that you're firing on the clarity cylinders and that you're not making a fundamentally confusing experience for your users, you take the idea of completion as the thing to avoid. You start something and you don't finish it. And if you're imagining going from one session to the next, you have to be thinking, before the player leaves, how can I make something start up and give the user an aspiration to return? And that's why, I don't know if that's exactly why everybody does the kind of, introduces those features that allow you to start something that'll finish in 24 hours. Loosely related to that are the ideas of daily login rewards, All of those things are tactics that they're using to naturally try to fight against these potential churn-out events with low engagement.
10 minutes.
I think I'll be done before that. So, kind of the big picture, or the thesis for the talk is you need to have a balanced strategy for trying to boost the high points of your experience on one side and mitigate the low points of your experience on the other side. And I think you can miss out on either side of that relatively easily. My assumption, and mostly probably because of my experience in the console development side of things, is that everything's fixated on trying to make the best possible experience. And I think a lot of inexperienced developers are focused on that as well. You don't see a lot of the expertise in cleaning up all of the weaknesses in an interface or in an experience for users. You don't see a lot of that coming from new developers. You see that coming from the big guys that have access to the analytics, who have a much clearer view on why they're losing users. It's not because it wasn't good enough. It's because you allowed a user out here and you never close that gap. So the recommendation becomes, don't let uncontained low points in your product take away the user's opportunity to experience your high points. You still need high points. It's your way of creating a strong memory in the user so that they remember you and they like you. I mean, the magnitude of my enjoyment is still relevant. It's just that this talk is kind of focusing on avoiding low interest points. So I thought I might have been out of time. Maybe I'm just talking too fast. But so with my extra time here, this point of view kind of allowed me to glean some answers about why there's such a ideological difference between the kind of new crop of developers dealing with the very large users, the new users that had come into the gaming sphere, and the older developers that had been just working their expert audience to that next step. So the new free-to-play approach has been evolving kind of via user audience selection to become a master at closing the gaps and closing out the weaknesses in the interface experience, and assigning rewards and incentives in the right places to keep people coming back regardless of the effectiveness of the core loop that's in place. In fact, you see it a lot. The big guys will grab any old core loop, our assumption is that they're cloning the game, when in fact all they really wanted was they just needed a thing, because the real work they're doing is creating a system for long-term engagement for the users, and they're making out like bandits as a result of it. The old approach was cultivated from people who paid up front. We have their attention. They already have a big sunk cost in, so they're much more likely to kind of overcome the weak points because they feel like they're already invested. And so when I was younger, it was all about trying to master exploration and get narrative in there and keep trying to improve the quality of the art, following down the footsteps of old narrative art forms like stories, books, movies, whatever. And so what you get there is that I was highly fixated on boosting the highs and generally blind to closing the gaps and the weaknesses of the user experience. And then on the flip side, you have the new guys who are generally they're highly fixated on protecting against losing users, particularly in a free-to-play environment where a user has no investment whatsoever. Their willingness to leave is much higher. Those two perspectives share very little, and as a result, they have a hard time seeing eye to eye. So that pretty much concludes the talk. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay.
Go for it. All right, maybe we can wait for the microphone.
Excuse me?
How many of you guys are game designers, by the way? Cool.
Okay, so first part of the question is, you said you worked on Spider-Man 2 with the mechanics and such.
Yeah.
Was it the swing physics or what?
Absolutely.
Exactly?
Well, it was swing physics, the combat system, the kind of wall locomotion, all the sprinting stuff.
Zip lines. Okay. I just want to say, I really want to shake your hand.
Nice.
Spider-Man 2 had I'll definitely go ahead, but Spider-Man 2 had I believe, out of any Spider-Man game to have ever been made after or before, the best swing physics ever.
Well, there's a good reason for it. We spent the whole project on it,
Yeah, and
for better or for worse.
I'm glad you guys did.
Nice.
Now, as for the user experience, I've loved Spider-Man since I was a little kid, and it's always been a big part of what I wanted to do when it comes to like designing characters and such. And one thing that I think really made it effective to keep me locked into that game, I still wish I had it. I still wish it was backwards compatible on the 360, which I think it is actually. I just need to purchase it.
On 360, I think it is. Maybe not on Xbox One to 360 though.
But I'd always fantasized about being able to do what Spider-Man did, and I think that would be a really big thing for new developers to take into consideration, is trying to base not on necessarily their fantasies of what they would want to do in the game, but of their consumers' fantasies and what they wanted to do. One of my favorite things to do was when I started up a new game is just do the charge jump, launch out, and then whip onto one corner of a building, just launch myself down the other
Absolutely.
street. Classic Spider-Man, and that I could not do it. If there was anything else going on in the game, I would just swing around for hours regardless. So I think they need to, one of the biggest things is to allow that kind of either exploration or movement that never gets old.
Well, I think you see some successes in the environment that focus on a kind of a freer play mode, one that's entirely built on intrinsic rewards. You know, the swing system offered a lot of creativity to users. I think Minecraft is a yet better example, right? That there's not a point, and the moment the point gets taken away, there's no reason to end the activity. And once I get comfortable expressing myself, there's really no end. There's no limit to how much I can keep doing that, and so it creates a really powerful experience, and that's why I think kids are really responding strongly to it. I think in everyday life, too much of our lives are directed, and so that freedom is getting positive reinforcement in the market.
I'm evaluating putting in multiplayer
Okay.
to increase engagement, and I've got like 3 different options, and I'm trying to figure out the best way. So asynchronous, I feel like that works well for the Zynga, kind of board games. Synchronous, and then on top of that, like 2 versus 2 synchronous. And I can't figure out what's the best way
What's
to
the
go.
platform?
It's going to be iOS.
Okay.
It's a very simple free throw shooting game.
So synchronous is a risk because people need to be on at the same time.
Sure.
The value of asynchronous is it opens up the number of potential people that can be interacting with each other by exponential numbers, right? Or infinitely more, basically. Because people's, the usage model on smaller games is also small session, right? So the expectation that those small sessions line up, that my lifestyle is exactly the same as whoever I'm going to play with becomes a severely limiting factor. Although at the same time, I think the industry is still trying to sort out what it means to create asynchronous multiplayer and how to make that kind of a rich interaction experience. I mean, I think Clash of Clans, or the whole model of kind of like Battle Pirates, War Commander, Clash of Clans type of game, is a great example of it, where I'm making single player content, and it's multiplayer in that you engage in my single player content, and so there's some concept of competition emerges from that, but I'm not actually playing directly with them. I think there's someone behind you.
Great talk, thanks.
Thanks.
So one question, obviously this is mobile and casual, so free to play is a big thing, but the old gamers are still there and console is still there. How would you take the lessons from free to play and apply it if you were going to do AAA or console now?
I mean, the simple answer is really just to be considerate of the moments in your game that are weak, or that dislocate the user from that kind of thread. I mean, how many times have we played a game that we paid $60 for, and there's just a moment where we're lost? We have no idea how to go on from here, and you muscle through it because you were accustomed to muscling through it. The problem with the new audience, the hundreds of millions of gamers that have basically been born yesterday, they don't have that tolerance. It never had to get built up in them. So if you want the AAA games to actually start really increasing its audience size, at the very least, you'll have to be able to kind of connect with the sensibilities of the new users and their unwillingness to kind of like try to overcome stuff that makes no sense.
So one question I have, so you mentioned sort of identifying these moments of confusion. What are your favorite methods for identifying those? Is it metrics? Is it user testing? And sort of what are your key lessons there for the low moments of engagement?
So I mean, I think there's 3 points on that curve. The first one, well, we'll start backwards. The last one is obviously analytics. Being able to measure user behavior is super valuable. I mean, again, like, you know, from my position, I see people arguing about it, and I don't understand that. It's just like being able to take a focus test and apply it to everybody instead of having a limited set. That said, so being able to see what's going wrong through the analytics is the kind of the post-launch point of view. The focus tests, bringing in people, watching them play, I don't think there's ever going to be a replacement for that. You also get that face-to-face connection to kind of see the emotional state of the user at that point, which can be super useful, and you can ask them questions afterward, which is nice. The point that lies before that, which I think is not done enough, is kind of more comprehensively gaming out the experience of playing through the game and identifying points where, you know, imagining that a user would become confused here, or at the very least analyzing the information that the user has before this choice and what the consequences are, and if making that leap makes any sense at all. And that's kind of what this is all about. You're going to use your methods of making the game that you want to make for the users you want to make, for the users who want to play it. Once you've done that and you have a pretty good idea, because that's hard enough all by itself, it's then to go back through it and look for weaknesses in the experience.
Great time. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Cool.